Section 51 of John Inglesant, A Romance. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. John Inglesant, A Romance by Joseph Henry Shorthouse. Section 51, Chapter 33. The Castillo di San Giorgio, or as it might more properly have been called, the Casa or Villa di San Giorgio, was built upon the summit of a small conical hill, amid the sloping bases of the Apennines, at a part of their long range where the summits were low and green. In that delightful region, the cultivation and richness of the plain is united to the wilderness and beauty of the hills. The heat is tempered in the shady valleys and under the thick woods. A delicious moisture and soft haze hangs about these dewy, grassy places, which the sun has power to warm and gladden, but not to parch. Flowers of every hue cover the ground beneath the oaks and elms. Nightingales sing in the thickets of a wild rose and clematis, and the groves of laurel and of the long-leaved olives are crowded with small creatures in the full enjoyment of life and warmth. Little brooks and rippling streams, half hidden by the tangled thickets, and turned from the courses by the mossy rocks, flow down from the hill ravines, as joyful and clear as in that old time when each was the care of some protecting nymph or rural god. In the waters of the placid lake are reflected in the shadows of the hills and the tremulous shimmer of waving woods. In this favored region, the Villa di San Giorgio stood upon its leafy hilltop, set in the background of the mountains. The steep slope was terraced here and there in patches of ground, planted with fruit trees, and at the foot, towards the south, a large lake slept beneath the blue sky, its shores lined with brushwood, interspersed here and there with grassy slopes, where the orchids and hyacinth and narcissus sprang up from the green rich turf. Through this pastoral land, at all seasons of the year, wandering shepherds with their flocks, peasants with their cattle and dogs, ladies and cavaliers from the neighboring villas, woodmen, vine dresses, fishermen from the lake, traversed the leafy stage and diversified the scene. But when the grape was fully ripe, and a long year was crowned at last, and jollity seemed for a time to fill the mellow golden-tinted land, then, indeed, wandering amid the woods and rocks, interspersed with vineyards and patches of yellow wheat, as you met the loaded wain, or came upon the wine-press trodden by laughing girls and boys, you seemed to understand the stories of the rural wanderings of the gods. For you met with many a scene to which it might well be fancied that they might still be allured, so that the garden at the foot of Mount Birmingham, where the roses grew, the gracious gods of plenty still filled the luscious vats, rustling zephyr, and still whispered love among the flowers, still came laden with the ripening odors of the fruit. The little cherub loves peeped out from behind oak stems and ruined plinth and sculptured frieze, half hidden among roots and leaves. The Castillo was a modern building, although there were ruins in one of the courtyards of a very antique date. It consisted of 3 or 4 lofty blocks of buildings, at right angles to each other, covered with low, red-tiled roofs. The principal windows were in the upper stories, and gave light to large and handsome rooms, from which on all sides the most enchanting landscapes satisfied the eye. The weeks that succeeded Inglesant's marriage grew into months, and the months into years in this delightful scene. The old Count spent some months in peaceful satisfaction with his daughter and her husband, delighted with the company of his one grandchild, a little boy. In the spacious dining saloon, with its cool polished floor, it was a pretty sight to see the old courteous nobleman tempting the child with the ripest fruit. The shaded light fell upon the plate and yellow ware on the table, and upon the old cabinets of Italian marqueterie against the walls, whilst by the carved mantelpiece sat the pleased parents, of whom it is recorded that in Rome they passed for the handsomest pair in Italy. In this way, the days of some 3 sunny summers passed away, while the winters were spent in the papal city. But this Arcadian life was not lasting. The old Count was not long content if absent from city life, and the time at the Castello hung somewhat heavily upon the hearts of both Inglesant and his wife. They were neither of them fitted by previous habits and education for a retired country life, but the circumstance which outwardly appeared to weigh upon Lauretta's mind was uncertainty concerning her brother's fate. From the time of the marriage the cavalier had disappeared, and from that day no word of tidings had been received respecting him. It was known that his circumstances were desperate, and the danger he lay under from secret enemies imminent. The account which her husband had given her of the condition in which he had seen Malvotti dwelt in her imagination, and she brooded over the idea of her brother in a similar state of destitution and misery. It seemed probable that, had he been assassinated, tidings of the event would have reached his family, and if alive, it was strange that he had made no application for assistance to those who were still so well able and so willing to render it. This suspense of mystery was more insupportable than certainty of evil would have been. The characters of Inglesant and his wife were of such a nature as most effectively to produce and aggravate this sleepless uneasiness. Upon Lauretta's lenient and gracious, if somewhat pleasure-loving disposition, the impression of the unkindness she had experienced from her brother faded without leaving a trace, and she thought only of some pleasant, long-past incidents, when she had been a pretty, engaging child, whilst the life of romance and excitement, combined with a certain spiritual quixotism, which Inglesant had so long followed, had rendered any other uncongenial to him, and it required little persuasion to induce him to re-enter upon it. But there were other cases at work which led to this same result. For many weeks a sultry wind had, without variation, passed over the south of Italy, laden with putrid exhalations from the earth, and by its sullen steadiness causing stagnation in the air. It would be difficult to describe the terrible effect upon the mind and system of the long continuance of such a state of the atmosphere. A restless fear and oppression of spirits prepared the body for the seeds of disease, and the contagion, which was not perhaps generated in the atmosphere, was carried by it with fearful rapidity. The plague struck down its victims at once in city and in country, and spared no rank nor conditions of life. Then all bond of fellowship and of society was loosened. Strange crimes and suspicions, strange even to that land of crime and treachery, influenced the lives and thoughts of all men. Innocent persons were hunted to death as poisoners and spreaders of infection. The terrors of the grave broke through the forms of artificial life, and the depravity of the heart was exposed in ghastly nakedness, as the bodies of the dead lay unburied by the waysides. The Castillo di San Giorgio, standing on the summit of a breezy hill in a thinly peopled district, was as safe a refuge as could perhaps be found, and if uneasiness of mind could have been banished, might have been a happy one. 300 years before, in the childlike unconsciousness of spiritual conflict which the unquestioned rule of Rome for so long produced, it had been possible in the days of Boccaccio for cultivated and refined society to shut itself up in some earthly paradise, and surrounded by horrors and by death, to spend its days in light, wit, and anecdote, undisturbed in mind and kept in bodily health by cheerful enjoyment. But the time for such possibilities as these had long gone by. A mental trouble and uneasiness which pervaded the whole human life at the most quiet times gave place, at such periods of dread and fear, to an intolerable restlessness which altogether precluded the placid enjoyment of the present, however guarded and apparently secure. The apprehension which most weighed upon Loretta's mind was that her brother, flying from some city where the pestilence raged, might be refused succor and assistance, and might even be murdered in the village to which he might flee. Some incidents were of daily occurrence, nor can it be wondered at that human precaution and terror became cruel and merciless, when it is an authenticated fact that the very birds themselves forsook the country places, and disappeared from their native groves at the approach of the plague. Nor were inanimate things even indifferent to the scourge. Patches and blotches of infection broke out upon the walls and houses, and when raped off would reappear until the house itself was burnt down. It was in the midst of this ghastly existence, this life and death, that a wandering mendicant, driven from Rome by the pestilence and craving alms at the Castello, asserted that he knew the Cavalier di Guardino, and that he was ill in Rome, doubtless by this time dead. The man probably lied, or if it was true that he had known the Cavalier, as he had passed him on the steps of the Trinita, the latter part of his story was certainly imaginary. It caused Loretta, however, so much distress that her husband, to comfort her, proposed to ride to Rome and endeavor to discover the truth. The plague was not so virulent in Rome as it were in the south of Italy, and especially in Naples. And to a man using proper precautions, the danger might not be very great. Loretta was distracted. The restless anxiety which gave her no peace until her brother's fate was known urged her to let her husband go. How then should she be more at ease when, in addition to one vision of dread and apprehensions, she would be haunted by another? The new anxiety seemed a relief from the old. Anyhow, the old was intolerable. Any change offered hope. Upon his arrival at Rome, Inglesant went hither and thither, from place to place, as one false report and another led him. Every beggar in the city seemed to have known the Cavalier. The contagion was sufficiently virulent to stop all amusements, and to drive every one from the city who was not compelled to remain. The streets were almost deserted, and those who passed along them walked apart, avoiding each other, and seldom spoke. The most frequented places were the churches, and even there the servants were short and hurried, and divested of everything that could attract the eye. In the unusual silence, the incessant tolling of the bells was more marked than ever. White processions carrying the host glided over the hushed pavements. Once Inglesant thought he had discovered the man of whom he was in search. The Cavalier, the story now ran, had arrived in Rome a few days ago from Naples, where the plague had the mastery, so that the living could not bury the dead. He had come, flying towards the healthy north, before the pestilence which had overtaken him as he entered the Giovanni Gate, and had taken refuge in a pest house, which had been established in the courtyard of a little church, es Salvatoris in Laterano ad Scalas Sanctas. Thither Inglesant repaired, in the full glare of an afternoon in the late summer. In a sort of cloister, round a little courtyard, the beds were laid out side by side, on which lay the dying and the dead. Between the worn stones of the courtyard, sprinkled with water, bright flowers were springing up. The monks were flitting about. 2 or 3 of these were also dead already. Inglesant inquired from the stranger who had arrived from Naples. He was dead, the monks told him, but not yet taken away for burial. He lay there, still upon his couch. They took Inglesant to a corner of the courtyard, where, looking down upon the dead body, he saw at once it was not that of the cavalier. It was the body of a man in the very prime of life, of a singularly noble and lofty look. He lay with his hands clasped over a little bit of crossed wood the monks had made, his eyes closed, something like a smile upon his lips. The cavalier will not look like that, thought Inglesant to himself. Who was he? In some part of Italy, doubtless, there were at this moment those who waited for him, and wondered, just as he and Loretta were doing. Perhaps in some distant Iserito, some one might be standing over the body of the cavalier, at just such a loss for a name and clue. It did not seem strange to Inglesant. He had wandered through these cross ways and tangled paths of life from a child. He went out into the hot sunshine and down the long straight street, by the great church of the Santa Maria, into the Via Felix, scarcely knowing where he went. Across the whole breadth of Rome, the few persons he met regarded him with suspicion, and crossed over to the other side. He himself carried a pomander of silver in the shape of an apple, stuffed with spices, which sent out a curious faint perfume through small holes. He wandered down the steps of the Trinita, where even the beggars were few and quiet, and seeking unconsciously the cooler air of the river, past the desolate Corso, and came down to the Ripetta, to the steps. The sun was sinking now, and the western sky was all ablaze with a strange light. All through the street, the image of the dead man had haunted Inglesant, and the silent city seemed full of such pale and mystic forms. The great dome of St. Peter's stood out dark and clear against the yellow light, which shone through the casements below the dome, till the whole seemed faint and ethereal as the air itself. In the foreground, across the river, were low meadows, and the bare branches of trees and leaves, of which had already withered and fallen. In the distance, the pollard firs upon the ramparts stood out distinctively in fantastic forms. To the left, the pinnacles and vanes of the city shone in the light. In front flowed the dark river, still and low. The large steps by the water's edge, usually so crowded and heaped with market produce, were bare and deserted. A wild, superstitious terror took possession of Inglesant's mind. In this solitude and loneliness, amid the busiest haunts of life, with the image of death on every hand, he felt as though the unseen world might at any moment manifest itself. The buried sky seemed ready to part asunder, and amid the silent courts and pavements, the dead would scarcely seem strangers were they to appear. He stood awaiting, as though expecting a message from beyond the grave. And indeed, it seemed to come. As he stood upon the steps, a grey form came along the pathway on the farther side, beneath the leafless trees, and down the sloping bank. It entered the small boat that lay moored beneath the alders, and guided itself across the stream. It stood erect and motionless, propelling the skiff doubtless by an oar at the stern. But from the place where Inglesant stood, the boat seemed to move of its own accord, like the magic bark in some romance chivalry. In its left hand the figure held something which shone in the light, the yellow glamour of the sunset, dazzling to Inglesant's eyes, fluttered upon its vestment of whitish grey, and clothed its transparent radiance, this shadowy revenant from the tomb. It made no stay at the landing place, but as though on an errand of life and death, it came straight up the wide curved steps, holding forward in its left hand a crucifix of brass. It passed within a step of Inglesant, who was standing, wonderstruck, at the summit of the steps, his silver pomander in his hand. As it passed him he could see the face, pale and steadfast, with a bright lustre in the eyes, and looking full upon him without pausing. The friar, if it were a friar, said, "He is in Naples, in that city or near it. You will find the man you seek. Aye, and far more than you seek. Let there be no delay on your part." Then, still holding the crucifix forward at arm's length, as though to cleave the poisoned air before him as he went, the figure passed up the street, turning neither to the right nor to the left, and, taking no notice of any of the few loiterers in his way, passed quickly out of sight. Inglesant turned to two fishermen who were coming slowly down towards the ferry. "Did you see that Severate friar?" he said. The men gazed at him uneasily. "He is light-headed," one of them muttered. "He has the plague upon him, and does not know what he says." Though he said this, they might have seen the friar all the same, for Inglesant's manner was excited, and those were perilous times in which to speak to strangers in the streets. The two men got into the boat, and passed over hastily to the other side. Naples. It was walking straight into the jaws of death. The dead were lying in the streets in heaps, sprinkled hastily with lime, and lavish gifts of freedom and of gold could scarcely keep the gallery slaves from breaking out of the city, though they knew that poverty and probably destruction awaited them elsewhere. But this strange message from another world, which bore such an impress of a higher knowledge, how could he disobey it? Far more than he sought. These words haunted him. He made inquiries at the monastery of the Jesuits in the Corso, but could hear nothing of such a man. Most of these to whom he spoke were of opinion that he had seen a vision. He himself sometimes thought it an illusion of the brain, conjured up by the story of the man who came from Naples, by the afternoon heat, and by the sight of the dead. But in all this the divine wisdom might be working. By these strange means the divine hand might guide. Let there be no delay on your part. These words sounded like a far-off echo of Father St. Clare's voice. Once again, the old habit of obedience stirred within him. Wife and child and home stood in the path, but the training which first love had been powerless to oppose was not likely to fall now. Once again his station seemed to be given him. Before, upon the scaffold at the Traitor's Dock in prison, he had been found at the appointed post. Would it be worth while now, when life was so much farther run out, to falter and turn back? The higher walks of the holy life had indeed proved too difficult and steep, but to this running footman's sort of business he had before proved himself equal. Should he now be found untrustworthy even in this? He resolved to go. If he returned at all, he would be back at the Castillo before any increased apprehension would be felt. If it were the will of God that he should never return, the Jesuit fathers would undertake the care of Loretta and his child. He confessed and received the sacrament at the church of the Gesu in the chapel of St. Ignacio, in the clear morning light, kneeling upon the cold, brilliant marble floor. It was the last day of July, very early, and the church was swept and garnished for the great festival of the saint. Inglesant did not wait for the satin festival, but left home immediately that the early Mass was done. End of chapter 33. Read by Elijah Fisher.